Hello, everybody. Welcome to the week two lecture. This is the first official section of the class. What I like to do before we dive completely into chapter one, which we will be touching on a couple of aspects of chapter one today. But what I like to do for the first lecture is kind of introduce students to what it means to think sociologically. What it means to use the sociological imagination, which is something that I'll explain in a few minutes here, and do what I like to call contextualizing the class. In other words, kind of introducing students to what the class is going to look like, how we're going to approach looking at social issues and things going on within our society throughout the semester. So this is good for a couple of reasons. I think it's a good kind of foundation, provides a good foundation for the start of the class. Also gives students a little bit of extra time to acquire the textbook if they're having trouble acquiring the textbook. And so let me go ahead and get started here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we'll pull up the slide here. So one of the goals of the class, there's a few primary goals of the class. One of the goals of the class is to try to kind of, and this is a goal of the discipline of sociology as a whole, is to try to dispel the difference between social issues that are occurring within our society and people's opinions about them, which we all have. There's nothing wrong with that. These opinions that we form are based on our own background and lived experiences. They're based on perhaps our ideological viewpoint. They're based on information that we consume via social media or just the media in general. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. We can't all be experts on every social issue. But one of the goals of sociology is to try to dispel the difference between opinions about social issues and evidence or scientific research-based informed information that we have about what's really going on in our society. In other words, statements and facts about what's going on in our society that are supported with data, that are supported with research, that are supported with evidence-based approaches to understanding our society. So sociology as a whole really seeks to dispel myths about our social lives and sort of try to bridge that gap between reality and how people think or feel about the world. A big portion of society, so there's this general sort of theme of a research-based approach to understanding social issues. A big portion of it is just understanding of how the way society is structured and how that structure of society has an impact on our lives. One of the things that, in terms of myths or people's opinions about social issues, a lot of these are influenced by the media. A lot of them are influenced by politics. Certainly, politicians and the political arena in our society for a long time has really preyed on public fear of something like crime to drive people's voting patterns. And this is, I think it's important to note, this is something that is not limited to one particular political party or affiliation. A lot of times people like to just associate that sort of thing with perhaps conservatism or republicanism, whatever it may be. That's absolutely not true. Using politics and as a political tool is something that's been going on for decades, if not centuries, in the United States. So specifically using crime or the perception of crime as a political tool. So we'll start up by an example of that. We'll start looking at first a Democrat. Bill Clinton in 1994 introduced the now famous 1994 crime bill, which, among other things, included things like the 3 strikes and you're out legislation that basically meant that if you were convicted of 3 or more felonies, that you went to prison for the rest of your life. We'll take a look at specifically at that. And then also mandatory minimum sentences. So we removed the ability of judges to arbitrarily, in some cases, assign differing levels of sentencing to convicted felons. But let's take a quick look. I'm going to minimize this and look at the 1994 crime bill, specifically some of the language on the crime bill I think is particularly important to look at. If you go down, there's lots of interesting things that you might take a look on here. This is a draft of the language for the crime bill. When we get down to the 3 strikes and you're out law, legislation, you can see that basically the language is mandatory life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for federal offenders with 3 or more convictions for serious violent felonies. And this was something that the public in a very widespread way really got behind and supported, because it was this idea of like, okay, if you have somebody that's committing violent felony offenses in our society and they do that 3 times, it seemed pretty reasonable, I think, to most people, Democrats and Republicans, that person should be in prison for the rest of their lives, that this is not somebody that you could rehabilitate. This is not somebody that is, or this is somebody that poses a significant threat to society. But there's a portion of this language that's very critical that they sort of added on, which says, or drug trafficking crimes. So now all of a sudden what was happening was, again, based on and preying on people's fear of crime in our society, fear of those violent felons in our society, they also tacked on life imprisonment for certain drug trafficking crimes. So now all of a sudden you have people that were being arrested for felony possession or sale of drugs and being sentenced to prison for the rest of their lives. And what we know now is that this obviously had a massive impact on our criminal justice system. It had a massive impact on our prison overpopulation issue in the United States, and caused all kinds of problems. To the point that now most people acknowledge, both Democrats and Republicans, that the 1994 crime bill was devastating to communities of color, to low-income people in the United States, and disproportionately incarcerated a large number of people in the United States, to the point where even in 2016, when Hillary Clinton, former President Bill Clinton's wife, was running for president herself, she was trying to backtrack on this particular issue. Let's listen to what she had to say.
South Carolina voter told your daughter, Chelsea, quote, "I think a lot of African Americans want to hear, you know what, we made a mistake." Chelsea said she's heard you apologize, but went on to say that if the voter hadn't heard it, then, quote, "it's clearly insufficient." Do you regret your advocacy for the crime bill?
Well, look, I supported the crime bill. My husband has apologized. He was the president who actually signed it. Senator Sanders
what about
voted
you, Senator?
for it. I'm sorry for the consequences that were unintended and that have had a very unfortunate impact on people's lives. I've seen the results of what has happened in families and in communities. That's why I chose to make my very first speech a year ago on this issue, Errol, because I want to focus the attention of our country and to make the changes we need to make. And I also want people, especially I want white people to recognize that there is systemic racism. It's also in employment, it's in housing, but it is in the criminal justice system as well.
Senator Sanders, earlier this week at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, you called out President Clinton for defending Secretary Clinton's use of the term super predator back in the 90s when she supported the crime bill. Why did you call him out?
Because it was a racist term and everybody knew it was a racist term.
So again, going back to what I was talking about, using crime and the fear of crime as a political tool is something that's been going on for a long time. So what we have here is a situation where the public perception of reality of what's going on in our society in terms of what we need to be concerned about doesn't always necessarily match up with the reality. And that's one of the things that sociologists try to do, is they try to see if there is evidence-based information to support some of these claims about what's going on within our society, or is this being sort of sensationalized either by the media or by politicians, so on and so forth. Another example, so now moving from Democrats to Republicans, obviously immigration is a definitely a good example of the fear of crime being used as a political tool. This was former President Donald Trump back in 2016 saying they are being released by the tens of thousands into our communities with no regard for the impact on public safety or resources. We're going to build a great border wall to stop illegal immigration, to stop the gangs and the violence, and to stop the drugs from pouring into our communities. So again, this was so the president of the United States sort of making this sort of plea and call out for, in the interest of safety of all Americans, for building this border wall. And so if we look at this, we have to ask the question, as a sociologist who asks the question, is this something that is supported by evidence, some of the claims that were being made? And so if we look at immigration data from US Customs and Border Patrol, Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, all of these agencies that we have that study this and collect information on what's actually happening in the United States with regards to immigration and crime and drugs and all these different things, we actually see that the evidence is not supported that this is as much of an issue as it was being made out to be by certain media outlets or by, in this case, the president himself. So 10.7 million unauthorized illegal immigrants were in the United States as of 2018. I think it's very important to point out that statistic, just because it gives you a kind of a perspective of what percentage of the population are we really talking about in terms of the overall threat that it might pose to society, right? We're talking about 4%, over 4% of the overall US population. We know that less than 6% of federal inmates are illegal immigrants. Many of the ones in prison are in prison for crimes that only illegal immigrants can be charged with. In other words, a lot of times this gets into how the data is collected and what you're using to measure these crime statistics. And something that we'll talk more about in chapter 2 when we talk about research. But when we talk about in some cases, the way you collect the data is a lot of times is when people, as soon as they enter the United States illegally, which is a crime, they are classified as criminals. So depending on what data set you're looking at and how they've measured this, those statistics, a lot of times you're seeing illegal immigrants being charged with crimes that only illegal immigrants can be charged with. Data for illegal immigrants often classifies those charged with traffic violations as criminals. So again, it's very important to understand the nuances and the context and the details of the information that's being presented to us. And this was ICE Enforcement and Removal Operations Report from 2017. Illegal immigrants are less likely to be criminals than native-born American citizens. This is particularly important, and this has been consistently shown in all different types of data sets. This is from the FBI crime data and the Uniform Crime Report. But what we know is that we have native-born American citizens here in our country, and a certain percentage of those people, unfortunately, are criminals. And consistently, it has been shown that it is a much higher percentage of our native population that are actually criminals than both illegal and legal immigrants that are coming into the United States. This is an important one as well. The majority of illegal drugs enter the United States through legal ports of entry, not the unguarded borderline. This is from US Customs and Border Protection statistics. So what we know is that when we talk about protecting our communities from drugs pouring into the United States, what we know is the majority of drugs actually enter the United States through legal ports of entry, shipping ports, highway checkpoints, airports, so on and so forth, by means of deception. They do not come into the country through the unmanned border lines. 90% of heroin, 88% of cocaine, 87% of methamphetamine. So in terms of building something like, say, a border protection wall, that's actually not going to be something that prevents drugs from entering the United States, or at least not to a significant amount. Now, it's important to back up and say, okay, does this mean that we're saying that safety of American citizens or crime or drugs or gangs or any of these things are not things that we need to be concerned about with regards to immigration policy? Absolutely not, right? Those are all things that are very important to think about. All this says is that the data doesn't necessarily support some of the claims that are being made by politicians from time to time. We know that between 1990 and 2013, the foreign-born share of the US population grew from 7.9% to 13.1%, and the number of unauthorized immigrants more than tripled from 3.5 million to 11.2 million. So we have this time period in the United States of this huge influx of immigration, and during that same time period, we see massive declines in overall crime rates. Violent crime dropping 48%, property crime dropping 41%. Now, this doesn't mean that we are saying that if you increase immigration or you see an influx of increased legal and illegal immigration, that's going to correlate or that's going to cause a decrease in crime. There are all sorts of things that cause the crime rates to go up and down. What we're saying is that there is no evidence that supports the opposite of that, which is what's being claimed from time to time by politicians, that the increase in immigration, actually we see an increase in crime. It's not supported with the data. And that's one of the things that as sociologists, we try to, trying to dispel some of these myths and understand that what's going on in our society that is supported with research. There's a couple of links here on the PowerPoint that you can take a look at. This was the famous Molly Tibbetts case from a few years ago, who was the 18 or 19-year-old girl that was abducted in Iowa, and it later came out that her abductor was in the country illegally. And of course, certain media outlets or politicians jumped on this as an example of the need for increased or stricter immigration policies. A couple things to point out. One, that when you're talking about individual cases of crime or certain things that are going on, that doesn't necessarily reflect the need for a wholesale change throughout the system, right? A sociologist would look at that and say, what we want to know is, is there data that supports an overall and significant increase in abductions or certain types of crimes based on illegal immigration that really calls for a wholesale change of the system, not a isolated particular incident. The second article is actually a link to a similar type of story where there was an abduction of somebody where the offender was a U.S. citizen. And again, going back to what we were saying about U.S. citizens and the percentage that are criminals, unfortunately, what we know is that these types of crimes occur in the United States frequently, not as, hopefully not too frequently, but frequently enough to where we know that US citizens commit these very same types of crimes, but nobody's concerned with their citizenship status until it can be used as a political tool. So the second article is a link to a similar type of abduction that probably wouldn't even have been reported in the news, except this article is trying to point out that, hey guys, this kind of stuff happens in the United States all the time from our own citizens. So stop preying on the public's fear of this kind of stuff with regards to immigration. So this is something that we'll spend some time throughout the semester talking about. What kinds of stories do major media sources typically report? This idea of how the media tends to sensationalize, whether few select accounts of crime or incidents or social issues, largely contributing to a somewhat misinformed society. Now, I do want to take this opportunity to say this doesn't mean that I'm saying that the media is basically reporting complete falsehoods, that the media is reporting complete lies about things, but it is important to understand that media has the #1 objective of making money. It's a for-profit industry. So a lot of times they are spinning certain stories or presenting perhaps maybe one side of the story or leaving out a lot of context about something that may have occurred. But this doesn't mean that CNN or ABC News or whoever it is that you consume your information from is the basic facts of what they're presenting about things that happened in the United States are complete lies. No, it just means that oftentimes we do need to be critical of them and understand that there may be certain bias in certain media outlets. So a lot of times the media is less concerned with context and nuances of particular stories. Well, how does this affect us? It definitely affects the way people see the world, the way people vote, all different kinds of impacts that it has on society. Another thing, this is maybe something that you've heard of in terms of historically speaking, crack versus powder cocaine sentencing discrepancies within our criminal justice system. This is a good example of not only the sort of political and media perpetuating misinformation about a particular issue to sensationalize it. But it's also an example of trying to look and understand how the structure of our society can also impact people's lives beyond just their individual choices, which is going to be a recurring theme throughout the semester, particularly for this class, as we learn about the sociological imagination. This is going to be real quick. We're going to take a look at a video from, let me close this one. We're going to take a look at a video from a professor from Columbia University talking about the pharmacological makeup of crack versus powder cocaine.
I mean, of course, we were studying crack cocaine because the original reason is that we wanted to try and develop treatments to help people who were addicted. And along the way in science, you make some discoveries. And one of the discoveries that we made was, oops, we said that this drug was 100 times more dangerous than powder cocaine. Not true. Inconsistent with the scientific evidence. When you compare crack cocaine to powder cocaine, produce identical effects, same effects. Some people say, well, crack cocaine is more intense and effects are more rapid. And so therefore, that justifies this sort of differential treatment under the law.
And it doesn't in your mind.
Well, I'm going to tell you, because it's certainly, when you compare crack cocaine, smoking crack cocaine to snorting powder cocaine, the effects of crack cocaine are more intense because they hit more quickly. But when you dissolve this powder cocaine in water and inject it intravenously, identical effects as smoking the drug. So what we had was basically a difference of route of administration, not drug. They are the same drug. It would be like somebody telling you that we're going to punish people who smoke marijuana more harshly than those people who eat marijuana in their brownies.
Right.
Doesn't make any sense. They're the same drug.
So what we see here is he's talking about the pharmacological makeup of crack versus powder cocaine and how they're essentially identical. One of the things that we've seen, and this is, again, this is an example of what it means to think about people's life circumstances, to think about and consider things that happen to them, in this case, perhaps ending up in prison, and the issue of, is this a result of individual choice, or is this a result of things going on within the social structure of our society, or perhaps both, right? So what we know is that there has been historically disproportionate sentencing of people for use and possession of crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. Currently, it stands at 18-1, so possession of 28 grams of crack cocaine yields a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence for a first offense, and it takes 500 grams of powder cocaine to prompt the same sentence. It used to be 2,800 grams. It used to take 2,800 grams up until 2010, when Congress passed the Fair Sentencing Act that reduced it from 100-1 discrepancy to 18-1 discrepancy. So what do you have? You have people making choices, making individual choices about the decision to take drugs. In this case, the same pharmacological drug, right? Cocaine, whether it's powder or crack cocaine, but receiving very different responses from our society, from our criminal justice system. So who does this end up affecting the most? Well, what we know is that crack cocaine is more widely distributed and used in lower income communities, particularly communities of color, whereas powder cocaine tends to be more expensive on the street and more distributed and used through higher socioeconomic status groups within our society, therefore shielding them from the consequences of that drug use. During the 1980s, going back to the media a little bit, if you look up at this picture in the upper right-hand corner, some of you may be familiar with that person. That is Pablo Escobar, famous Colombian drug lord. the media was definitely, and politicians were definitely perpetuating this myth that there was, that we needed to be overly concerned about this crack epidemic that was sweeping the nation. Now, this doesn't mean that there wasn't an influx of crack cocaine into the United States, that it wasn't a problem in certain neighborhoods in the United States, that it wasn't something that was causing a lot of collateral damage and needed to be addressed. But what we know is that there was a huge influx of powder cocaine in the United States in the 80s as well, right? There's been, books and documentaries and all sorts of things and all kinds of information that have come out that tells us that there was a huge influx of cocaine overall in the United States. But we weren't hearing about that through the media. We weren't being told that this is something that we need to be concerned about and vote on legislation and policy about the same way that we were with the crack cocaine stories. So it's important to understand, again, this is just sort of lending support for this idea of evidence-based information about our society, right? Were we making these political claims based on information we were getting from the drug enforcement agencies, information we were getting from law enforcement, information we were getting from the DEA, whatever it may be, to form these opinions, or were we allowing the media and politicians to drive what we were concerned about in the United States? A lot of this comes down to when we talk about opinions and social issues and how we see the world, a lot of it comes down to what's referred to as ideology, which is a set of beliefs or attitudes about the way the world is or the way the world ought to be, right? And a lot of this comes down to people just ideologically seeing the world differently. I don't want to say one is right or one is wrong. People just see the world differently. And that's one thing that we're going to talk about today and then throughout the semester, what it means to think sociologically and what it means to think more individualistically. Doesn't mean that thinking sociologically is right and thinking individualistically is wrong, but we're going to talk about the nuances between those two. So examples of different ideologies, extreme ideologies might be radical Islam or ISIS or the Westboro Baptist Church, which is an anti-LGBTQ organization. But most of us can more easily identify and relate to liberalism or socialism or nationalism, progressivism, conservatism, etc. And so how does these ideologies affect the world? It causes this sort of general way of structuring our society, and we see this kind of constant push-pull that's going on. People want things a certain way, other people want things another way, so on and so forth. Some people are arguing and advocating for more consideration of the social structures and how those are impacting people's lives and how those are impacting what happens to people. Other people are arguing and advocating more for consideration of individual accountability and people being responsible for their own actions and decisions and so on and so forth. Again, neither one of those is right. Actually, both of them are right, and neither one of them is wrong, right? There's usually the truth lies somewhere in the middle. But this is kind of where we get into what it means to think sociologically. Most of us can pretty easily identify with the individualistic perspective, right? Myself included, and it's the individual perspective is correct. It's not wrong. But when we get into thinking sociologically, that becomes a little trickier. So we're going to try to explain kind of what it means to think sociologically. So C. Wright Mills developed this concept known as the sociological imagination. And this is the recognition of the interdependent relationship between who we are as individuals and the social forces shaping our lives. So the way that he tried to illustrate this particular concept was to break things down into two main categories. Private troubles or private issues, and public troubles are public issues. So a private trouble or private issue is a problem arising from our immediate relationships with particular individuals or as a result of our own individual actions. In other words, if we think about somebody succeeding or failing, somebody doing something great or somebody ending up in prison, whatever it may be, we can easily make that connection and that correlation between their own individual choices, their own individual actions, perhaps their own individual relationship or experience with somebody else that caused a particular situation to occur, good or bad, right? Again, this is right. This is correct. I'm somebody that's individualistic myself. Whenever somebody's in a certain circumstance, the first thing I think of is, okay, well, what did they do? Or what didn't they do? Or what were the individual actions? It's not wrong. But C. Wright Mills developed this idea of understanding the relationship, the interdependent relationship between who we are as individuals and those choices that we make and how the structure of our society not instead of, but also or additionally impacts our lives. And that's where we get into the public troubles or public issues. These are problems that we face as a consequence of the positions we occupy within the larger social structure of society. Now that's a kind of a mouthful, right? The problems we face as a consequence of the positions we occupy within the larger social structure. So as people, looking at me on this Zoom video, if you look at me and I was to ask you, what are some positions I'm occupying within the larger social structure of our society? A simpler version of that question is, what am I? What do you see when you look at me? Be nice, please. But students would normally, if we were in person, students would start coming up with answers like, well, you're a teacher. And absolutely, that's a position I'm occupying in the larger structure of our society. You're a man. You are, I'll just tell you, I have a wife and 2 kids. I think I mentioned it on the introduction video. And so you might assume that I'm heterosexual. That can be a position that I'm occupying in the larger structure of society. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I'm white. These are positions that I'm occupying in the larger structure of society. And the list goes on and on. There's lots of them. So if we think about public troubles or public issues, these are problems we face as a result of those positions that we're occupying in the structure of our society. So examples, if we think about somebody becoming unemployed and the fundamental question of, is somebody becoming unemployed a private trouble or private issue? Or is it a public trouble or public issue? Well, of course it is a private trouble or private trouble or private issue, because if somebody doesn't show up for work, or they cuss out their boss, or they don't do their job, and they get fired and they become unemployed, that is absolutely a private issue, right? That's resulting from their own individual actions or behavior or relationships. But it can also be, not instead of, but it can also be a public issue, because what we know is that there are things that occur within the structure of our society that cause people to become unemployed beyond any individual choices or actions that they engage in. This could be a result of a pandemic, right? That destroys or devastates the economy and millions of people get laid off from their jobs, not as a result of any of their individual actions. So we see that if unemployment can be both a private trouble and a public issue. Drug addiction. We can easily, most of us, myself included, easily make that connection between drug addiction being a private trouble. People making an individual choice and being accountable for that choice to use drugs and become addicted to drugs. Therefore, drug addiction is a private trouble. But thinking about it sociologically, we can also see that being addicted to drugs can also be a public issue, because there are a lot of decisions that are made at high levels within our government, within our society, that impact the very availability of drugs to even so that somebody can even become addicted to them. We have this opioid addiction problem in the United States, which is a direct reflection of policies going on within our pharmaceutical industry, within legislation in Washington, so on and so forth. And so we see that drug addiction can also be a public issue or public trouble. Same thing with somebody becoming imprisoned, and we'll talk about more about this in a second. But somebody can be in prison, obviously, for a private issue or a result of their individual actions. But in addition to that, there might be certain things that occur within our society that cause somebody to become in prison that didn't necessarily have anything to do just with their individual choices. Remember, going back to the crack versus powder cocaine example, we saw that there were people that were making that private trouble, that private choice, that individual choice to use drugs or sell drugs during the 1980s. Some of them were going to prison, some of them weren't, for pharmacologically the same drug. That's a reflection of something happening within our social structure of our society, impacting what happens to people in addition to their individual decisions. So it's important to think about, when we go back to the discussion of ideology or how people see the world, either through this individualistic lens or through this more of a social lens, Here in the United States, we are known around the world and within this country as being a very individualistic society, and it's sort of built into the fabric of who we are, right? This idea of bootstrap ideology, this idea that people are responsible for their own fate in life, this idea that we've created a society where all the tools are in place, all the mechanisms are in place for people to be successful in life, and if people aren't successful or they're struggling or they're having some problems, it's directly their own fault. It tends to be kind of the main ideology of our society. And it's not wrong, but oftentimes it makes it so that people acknowledging social issues in the United States is very difficult because we subscribe and believe so heavily in this idea of bootstrap ideology, right? Something's wrong, you're having a struggle, pick yourself up by your bootstraps and get moving, right? Take care of yourself, work harder, whatever it may be. And that's absolutely true. But one of the goals of the class is to make it clear and help people understand how the structure of our society also has a big impact on people and it calls for the need for us to look at things through a different lens. Obviously, poverty is something that we could look at through that lens and ask the question of, is this a private trouble or a public issue? Poverty or wealth accumulation can be a direct result of individual actions, right? People studying hard in school, people working hard through their job, people being entrepreneurs and innovators, coming up with something that allows them to be successful, being lazy, not showing up for work, doing something that allows them or causes them to be poor or out of work, whatever it may be. Absolutely, right? That's 100% correct. But it's important, thinking about C. Wright Mills, that we look at and understand poverty or wealth accumulation through that public lens as well. Let's take a look at this next video.
It was a time when hundreds of thousands of GIs came home ready to start families, but had no place to live.
In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it was to provide loans or the backing for loans to average Americans so they could purchase a home.
Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans: you can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. Tax dollars helped make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course, in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, it was an interesting experience, interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences, very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
So I kind of want to set the stage for the video right now. So we've got we're post World War II. We've got all these soldiers returning home from the war over in Europe and in the Pacific. And this is a really critical time in American history. This is a really transitional time in American history, a big transitional time for our economy and our financial industry. And the reason it is because prior to this time period, if you wanted to own property or own a home in the United States, to do that, you really had to have 80–90% of the value of that property in order to be able to purchase something like that. They didn't have these wholesale, large scale financing options for people. So what happened was property ownership in the United States was pretty limited to the extreme wealthy in our society. This was a major transitional time because the Federal Housing Administration comes on the scene and adopts the 30-year home loan. And what this does is allows people, everyday working class Americans, the ability to purchase a home and ultimately accumulate wealth throughout their lifetime. If you're like me and most people, the single greatest investment that you'll make throughout your lifetime of the largest value is your home. This home allows you to perhaps finance the education of your children, or allows you to accumulate wealth through appreciation of value of your home, so on and so forth. And so this was a major transition in American history because we're essentially creating the middle class through the accumulation of wealth of everyday working class Americans. But at the same time, we are systematically excluding certain segments of our population from participating in this very important transformative time in the United States.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even one or two non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized a national appraisal system where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating, and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Where one's family lives in America is not just a matter of taste and preference. You have the issue of housing and wealth. The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity. So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement. It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
My family, like a lot of families in Detroit, struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market, one white, one black. A housing market with one with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. The house today, 5-bedroom house, is worth about $20,000. The same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburb were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property, given title, and subsequently wealth. And on another hand, where people were not given access to property, did not generate wealth, and did not generate the kind of opportunity for the next generation.
So again, we can look at this issue of poverty or accumulation of wealth in the United States through that private trouble or private lens, but we can also look at it through the public trouble or public lens and understand that there are policies and things that go on within the structure of our society that, in addition to private issues or individual actions, also impact the amount of money that people have. Now, I do think that it's important to note that, that was, over 70 years ago. We have deinstitutionalized a lot of these policies. In other words, now it is illegal to engage in these types of real estate practices, although many people argue that a lot of this kind of stuff still operates under the surface in terms of housing discrimination. But we have deinstitutionalized. We've made a lot of improvements and deinstitutionalized these discriminatory practices, if you will. So a lot of people might look at that video and go, okay, you got this really grainy black and white video from 70 years ago when this occurred, but this doesn't have an impact on where we are today in society, right? This doesn't have an impact on me standing here today in front of you. Absolutely, it does. I understand that that's the tendency to view it from that lens, but we're essentially talking about my grandparents' generation. So would I assume that my grandparents' financial status had no impact on my life and where I ended up? Absolutely, it did. It impacted the type of education that my parents got, the impact of the type of opportunities that my parents had that ultimately, by extension, impacted the type of opportunities that I had available to me based on our financial status growing up. So when we look at and think about transmitting wealth from one generation to the next, and we're only talking about really a couple of generations ago, absolutely, it still has a major impact in the United States today and where people are financially speaking. When we talk about wealth, it's important to note when we talk about wealth, we're talking about the total value of somebody's material assets minus any debts that they have at any particular single point in time. So that's not the same as somebody's income. Obviously, there are lots of layered discussions we could have about income in the United States as well, but we're talking about what people own, right? Income is this money that you receive over time. Most of us think of it in terms of, income that we receive for our jobs, but it could be government payments, it could be stipends. And what we do know is that we can spend more money than we make, right? So wealth is actually what it is that you own. So what are your value of your material assets minus whatever debts that you might have, credit card, home loans, so on and so forth. And what we know, and this is just some data from 1983 to 2013, but we know that this data is widely supported in all different types. We see the median net worth of US white households as a multiplier of Black household wealth from 1983 to 2013. So what we're seeing is that in 1983, the median net worth of US white households was 8 times the amount of Black households in the United States. So yes, the housing discrimination and some of those policies were 70 years ago, but this has a long lasting effect on our society, right? In 1989, when we see economic upswing in the United States, like booming economic times, we see that number skyrocket to 17 times the amount of wealth for white households as a comparison to Black households. Then from 1990 to 2004, we see it kind of flatten out. When I say flatten out, it's important to note, I'm still talking about 7 and 6 times the amount of wealth. So if somebody, if one particular household has $100,000 worth of wealth, that means that the white household is going to have $600,000 worth of wealth. Major differences, right? And then in 2007, 2010, as we see economic downswing, right, economic down times, we see that number start to creep up again, just like it did during economic upswing. So in 2013, they showed at 13 times the amount of household wealth. And I looked at some data recently that showed that currently, I think it stands at 10 or 11 times. So the median amount of household wealth for whites in the United States is 10 to 11 times the amount of Black households currently in 2020. when we talk about this, may be something that you've heard talked about as before. When we talk about wealth distribution in the United States, so all of the wealth that's available to be owned in the United States is owned, 84.5% of that wealth is owned by 10% of our population, owning 85% of our wealth. Another 15% of our population owns 11.5% of the wealth. So the top 25% of our population owns over 95% of our wealth. And you can see that the bottom 75% of our population only owns 4% of the overall wealth. 75% of the population of the United States only owns 4% of the total overall wealth in the country. That's one of the greatest disparities of any country you'll see in the world, and particularly any industrialized country that you'll see in the world. Huge wealth gap distribution in the United States overall. So again, when we think about the issue of poverty and we think about C. Wright Mills and we apply our sociological imagination, we can see that this is absolutely a social issue as well, a public issue as well as an individual or private issue resulting from people's individual actions, right? In addition to. So going back for real quick to somebody being in prison, right? We might look at somebody being in prison and make that direct correlation between their individual actions, which is absolutely correct, right? People make choices. Sometimes those are bad choices and they may end up in prison. But what I want to do is look at this through a little bit of a public lens, right? So let's look around the world at the total prison population of different countries around the world based on, I think it's broken down by continent and then by country. So we'll start with Africa. South Africa in Africa has the largest prison population of 154,000, followed by Ethiopia at 100,000, followed by Egypt, and so on and so forth down the line. And of course, we need to, when we're comparing different countries and their prison population, you have to think about things like you know, how rural the area is, the overall population, what is the infrastructure of that country? Do they have a criminal justice system? Do they have a large system of government that's able to process crime in the same way, so on and so forth? Definitely things to consider, but this is just to give you a general idea of world prison population. If we look at Asia, we can see that China is has the largest prison population of any country in Asia with 1,700,000. India has 478,000, followed by Thailand, followed by Indonesia, followed by Iran. China has over 1 billion people, right? So huge population, huge system of government, huge infrastructure, definitely something to keep in mind. Look at the Caribbean real quick. We see Cuba, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Puerto Rico, so on and so forth. Definitely take a look at some of these countries on your own time if you have one in particular that you're curious about. If we look at Central America, we see that Mexico has 213,000 people in prison, followed by El Salvador with 36, and then some pretty low numbers down the line. We look at South America. We see that Brazil has a very high prison population, 755,000 people in prison, followed by Argentina at 100,000, Colombia, Peru, Venezuela. Of course, we want to look at Europe, right? Start looking at some of these industrialized nations that are at least somewhat similar to the United States. We see Russia at 486,000 people in prison, followed by Turkey, followed by England at 78,000. Poland, France, Spain, Germany, Italy, right there hovering around 50 or 60,000 people in prison. We go into the Middle East, we can see that Saudi Arabia has 61,000, followed by Iraq, then Jordan, 45 and 20,000 respectively. And then lastly, we look at Oceania, and we see that Australia, the country continent of Australia, has 41,000 people in prison, followed by New Zealand with only 9. My wife tells me that my primary form of communication is sarcasm. So this is usually when I kind of say, well, okay, there's nothing else. And the students are like, well, shouldn't we look at North America? And I say, well, we can look at North America, but there really isn't anything interesting going on in North America, but we'll go ahead and look at that. And of course, there is something interesting going on in North America. So now we have the United States We see that we have 2,094,000 people incarcerated in the United States. The next closest country is China with 1,700,000, yet China has over 3 times our population. We are 340 million people in the United States. China's like 1 point whatever billion. So again, I ask that question, somebody being in prison, a private trouble or a public issue or both? Clearly, what this is suggesting based on, again, data or evidence-based information is that being in prison in the United States is absolutely a byproduct of individual decisions and a private issue, but it is also, in addition, has to be a byproduct of something going on within our society, that we see such a huge prison population affected by all kinds of things, right? The 1994 crime bill, stricter immigration policies, whatever it may be, crack versus powder cocaine, things going on within the structure of our society that also impact the likelihood of somebody ending up in prison in the United States. Either that or we're just a really deviant society and unable to follow the law, which I don't think is the case. So again, just kind of introduce you to what it's going to be like to think sociologically in the class, to think about the sociological imagination and understand that interdependent relationship between who we are as individuals and the social forces shaping our lives, right? So asking questions like, how do people experience the world? What makes us experience the world differently? Remember those social positions that we're occupying within the larger structure of our society? How do people experience the world differently because of those? What are the major things that cause people to experience the world differently? Do some people hold privileges that other people don't? So on and so forth. So just a few things that we're going to be looking at throughout the semester. And we'll definitely, we touched on a few of the concepts that they talked about in chapter 1, but we'll dive more into that next week, specifically with regards to chapter 1. So hope you enjoyed the lecture, and we'll see you guys next time. Let me go ahead and end my screen share here. And please don't hesitate to email me if you have any questions about anything. Thanks, guys.